The far shore. We'd agreed to stay at Brian's family cottage until the lake froze over. This far north, that gave us just under 6 months, late October, mid-November at the longest. It was a suggestion, and if I couldn't agree, what grounds did I have for argument? We had relied on my income, gone now with so much else, and here he was offering up a place to stay. I hadn't wanted to leave the Netherlands. Returning to the States felt like compounding defeat, but Brian insisted. When the hospitals are over in Amsterdam, do you think they're going to save the Americans? He said. When the plane landed in Miami, the only direct flight we could get, we stayed in a hotel downtown for a month until the hospitals there filled up and the views of the bay and boats bobbing in the blue no longer sparkled with promise from our perch behind the thick glass windows. My trust in a temporary exile from international life began to reveal its incredible foolishness. To speak of time became so alarming, we did it only in sentence fragments, tail ends of which slipped sideways away from me. We could go. What about just for? By August, then we rented a car and drove north to Minnesota. Brian's family cottage was on the southern bend of the lake, the far shore of which formed the border with Canada. Morning fog and afternoon sun. A sprint of lawn, still brown with winter, and then a small dock yawning out over the rocks. It was used only in the summer and, even then, infrequently. When we arrived, the sheets were stuffed in big black trash bags, the mattresses covered in plastic tarps. Lemon and mildew hung in the air so thickly it was like breathing through a kind of gauze. We will wash up in the lake today, he said, hefting bags out of the trunk, and I will call about getting water switched on tomorrow. Standing on the front lawn, I could see tiny barges of ice still floating out in the middle of the water. On the drive through town, we'd seen few others. A man smoking in front of a diner in quick, persistent pulls. A masked attendant sitting in the window of a gas station. Half the lights in the sign outside blown out. It's early in the season, Brian said. The lakeshore itself was desolate. Tiny cottages rimmed one side of the shore, buried among the tamaracks and the pines. Hunks of snow, dirtied and hardened, melted in corners of driveways. A dog barked from somewhere in the middle distance, but the house next door, visible over an unruly hedge of dogwood, stood empty and dark. For the first time in a long while, I was now alone with my husband, a feeling that at first, similar to marriage itself, was like squeezing my foot into a shoe to sizes too small, but then, like almost nothing. In the morning I made a start setting up the cottage while Brian dealt with the water, unpacked the lawn furniture, and rummaged around in the toolshed. It wasn't so bad if I accepted it as a kind of experience. Of course, as Brian had suggested, we were also safe here, far away from other people, other vectors. The cottage had 3 main rooms, a sunlit dining porch at the back, a kitchen in the middle, and a living room in the front, facing the lake. 2 small bedrooms stemmed off the living room. The linoleum peeled in the kitchen corners, and rust lined the bottoms of the appliances like a cancer. The wood paneling on the walls and across the ceiling warped slightly where the nails had come loose. On the mantel over the fireplace in the living room, the hands of an antique clock twitched at 11:58 p.m. I lingered, let my fingers erase the dust in 5 clean lines over the clock face. It didn't appear damaged enough to discard, but it didn't work either. It's a camp, Brian said. In the hurried way he swept up my thoughts before they could become words. After 20 years together, he'd had time to hone this skill. The idea is, it's rustic. He dropped an armful of firewood in a tarnished copper bucket next to the fireplace. Did you call about the internet? I smoothed the woolen blanket over the yellowed upholstery. How are we going to know what's going on? But he continued to ignore me, building a tiny teepee of kindling over the newspaper he'd crumbled in the grating. Does it make a difference? My husband operated in the theoretical, believing the ends justified the means. I had become increasingly unsure that anything ever truly ended, at least in a geopolitical sense. Brian's democracy-building work, a senior political advisor for USAID in Sudan, 2 stints as a country director for NDI in Syria, then Kenya, and an assortment of jobs at startup political NGOs, briefly, in the Far East, had sent us chasing changing regimes and opening doors for US markets. I had once been attracted to the open doors, the romance of the exotic, even Brian's hard-edged idealism. But as the years accumulated, I wanted health insurance, A vehicle that didn't require jumper cables, a climate controlled apartment from which to unpack our rucksacks in a city with clean cafes. He said he grew caged by my pragmatism, my need for money, even if I made it myself. Money bought movement, trespass. It was hard to tell who had capitulated and who had misunderstood. In the morning, I slipped a sweater over my bikini and walked out to the dock. The sky was white and clean as paper. I swept my hand upward, keeping my fingers straight as blades, trying to slice the sun. When I was very small, on a blustery beach on the southern coast of Maine, my grandmother had told me to enter the water 6 inches at a time to avoid the shock of cold. The lake water at its fringes now was about that temperature, in the high 50s, but at its core it was at least 15 degrees colder. It was clear and lifeless. I could see all the way down to the rocks, but not where the water ended at the far shore. I dove, long and shallow, off the dock. My grandmother was dead now, but even she would have found the cold bracing. I stretched my arms out in front of me and listened to the water as it slipped past me, around me, into me. The coldness brought its own kind of crackling silence. Thin tentacles of reeds looked as if they were suspended in aspic. I kicked and then dove deeper, breathing out thick bubbles of air before clawing back up to the warmer skin of the water. I wanted the cold, but only just to the brink of danger. As I breached the surface, sucking in gobs of raw, humid air, I heard the sound of church bells. I turned and turned in the water but faced only an empty halo of spruce trees. I followed the gentle thrum of the bells 3 docks down the shore, but with each stroke their distance seemed more uncertain. At once, they surrounded me, and then suddenly were carried off with the clouds. By the time I arrived home, my fingertips were blue and my feet covered in dirt and pine. Brian was reading by the fire. A slew of delivery packages lay on the carpet. "What did you order?" "I want to spend this time doing good work," he said, gesturing to a stack of books on the far coffee table, some still enclosed in their cellophane wrapping. His old standby of Schopenhauer, but now Howard Zinn and Ibram X. Kendi, a bell hooks book on teaching, a series of Toni Morrison's novels. Fiction, interesting. "I thought we would try to get some kind of seasonal work," I said. "This is work," he said, adjusting a pair of gold-rimmed Coke bottle glasses mismatched against the salt and pepper scruff of his beard. "Okay, a job," I said. "You used to see the value in the arts. Is that your plan, then? To sit and read for 6 months? Hasn't all this taught us that it's very silly to make plans?" "When I was swimming, I heard bells," I said. "Is there a church around here?" I turned to chuck another log on the fire. "Careful," he said. "Poplar burns a lot of ash. Don't get it on that pretty sweater." He often left my questions unanswered. In his eyes, his role was to dispense knowledge at will, mine to accept it, hands outstretched. For so long I had been complicit, an acolyte at the altar. By late June, 2 months into our stay, the sunset fractured the cloud cover well into the evening. In bed I tried to transform my husband into what he had been before, but all I had were outlines of a half-remembered dream. The reflection of the lake made a chiaroscuro of crimson against the darkness. In those last dregs of sun, Brian was reading. I knew what lay under the covers, the fat dappling his thighs, the sweat in the crevasses between his legs, but in such a humble repose. The movement of his lips just barely perceptible as his eyes traced the page, the cliff of his jawline. He looked almost erotic, almost as he had been. I put the Pinot Noir back on the nightstand and brushed a long line down his scarf with my toe. My eyes were cloudier than they had been, but I knew what could happen if I scattered my bangs just so, took his finger in my mouth, slowly. I sucked as he continued to read, hoping that time hadn't made a joke of my sincerity. "Remember the Masai Mara?" I said. "The light on the Savannah looked just like this from the tent." "Morning light," he said. "You're thinking of the morning light. When we were young," I whispered and fluttered my fingertips over his chest. "We married when I was in my early 20s, Brian just turning 30. We danced to Moon River. I had grown up in a small town, and there he was, all adventure and horizons." Brian put down his book on the nightstand but whispered back, "Your hands are as cold as death." "Don't say that," I said. "Don't joke about that now." He turned away from me. The air outside whined with mosquitoes and the mating calls of male crickets rubbing their wings together. The sun fell under the lake. When I drew flannel sheets up to my chin, I noticed their tiny moth holes. I spent most of my days out walking. Drifts of summer air arrived at last. Brian read and completed small tasks around the cottage, turning the soil over in the flower beds, chasing dry patches on the lawn with the sprinkler, restaining the deck. It's safe right here, he said. Where do you need to go? The virus wasn't in the air, it was in bodies, and as far as I could see, there weren't many people this far north. Less than 2 months into our supposed safety, one that Brian kept reminding me of with phrases like our good fortune and compared to others, I felt only increasing unease. Elsewhere, there were people who still lived in their cities and discreetly met friends in the aisles of grocery stores, who still ran in parks and drove on highways. I was confined to this relative wilderness, penned in and cut off. The small community tucked itself into one corner of the lake. It provided some comfort, even if much of it was boarded up. The lakeshore path led to a public beach with a long dock and intersecting subsidiary docks, where a few small pontoon boats bobbed on their moorings. A small handwritten sign noted all beaches were closed for the season. In town, I found a small grocer, a hardware store, a bakery, a small outdoor outfitter's shop selling exorbitantly priced kayaks, a gas station with an attached coffee shop, the offices of state park rangers, to t-shirt shops and several restaurants, including a brew pub. I could make it to midday, but then I needed something for the melancholy. The pub let me take the beer to go if I promised to return the glass. It tasted of maraschino cherry and bitterness. I sat on the closed and deserted beach in the cottony warmth of the sunlight and listened to the music the wind played on the water. I knew I was lost psychologically. When I was very young, a supervisor had told me with a surfeit of glee that I could sell anything to anybody. For years, this had been a driving mantra. I proved him right. I made a lot of money selling cultural experiences to the very wealthy then, once we arrived in Europe. Highly curated artisan goods that passed as art, items made by an individual rather than a machine, an individual with a degree of foreignness to the North American market, an individual who could be marketed as impoverished but still an artisan so that the buyer could feel a sense of altruism with each purchase. Finally, I'd figured out how to sell culture itself, in all its vague plasticity, by posting photos to social media with witty captions, a kind of aspirational identity. As an influencer for the middle-aged, I had never made more money, but now like a stream in August it had dried, fled. When I finished my beer, I walked up a series of small stone steps to a grassy public promenade. I liked this spot. A woman my age stood, smoking, next to a plaque at the top of the steps. She wore a red baseball cap over a bob of brown hair, a yellow Vikings t-shirt. There used to be a hotel here, she said. Did you know that? The plaque displayed a photo of a chalet-style hotel, a roadster parked out front. Good beer, she said. That's my favorite one too. I'm Carol. What happened? I said. To the hotel? Oh, it burned down ages ago, maybe 50 or so years ago. Hardly anyone made it out alive. She held out her pack to me. Aren't you worried? I said, gesturing at her cigarette. About the virus, your lungs? She shook her head. Oh, we all meet the fire in the end. See you around, she said. I read the names of the fatalities on the plaque. They were embedded there still, speaking through the shivering grass, reminding me of the mistakes I should have made. When I arrived home, Brian had gotten the television working and turned it to the news. It's not great, he said. He looped his arm around my waist and for a moment I was almost comfortable. Did you buy cable? I said. They're closing the borders, he said. Completely. On the screen, an airport departure board flickered with flight cancellations. We got out, he said. Do you know how afraid I was we wouldn't get out? He held me close to him from behind, then tenderly kissed my earlobe. We had played this game before, though it wasn't like before. In Khartoum, in Aleppo, a helicopter had always come. The danger, the escape, had held almost a sexual tone. It had always been easiest to orgasm in the hotel rooms of our evacuations. And if they never open again? Are we meant to stay here in our little national silos? You're unhappy? Border closures keep people out. There are people who want. But Brian wouldn't believe my conspiracy theories about politicians using pandemic policy to cleanse their populations. The world was closing up like a fist. Everyone I knew was split up and locked away. What about Canada? I said, looking out across to the far shore, as if that had ever been a real possibility. Closed, he said. The UK closed, Kenya closed, Australia closed. Stop, I said. The EU, he said, with an enthusiasm that revealed his hand. Closed. I wrenched myself away from him. In the bedroom, I put on a swimsuit and fled to the dock. You know, he said to my back, for some people, the borders have always been closed. An asylum of loons cried out from the center of the lake. Other loons, little clusters of hysteria, responded from nearby docks. A yellow buoy rocked back and forth despite the utter absence of wind. The lake stretched sheer and immobile in front of me, a dull, nocturnal blue. I dove off the dock and crawled out toward the buoy. My arms cleaved the water, my legs smacked into its surface. I needed to get my hands on some pakshi, some clonopin. I matched each slaughtering stroke to the chorus of loons. The sun was hot overhead. By the time I reached the buoy, the sound of the bells was deafening, but the loons had flown. I pivoted in the water toward the next buoy, dove under, and then breached the surface with a great gulp of air. I clenched my shoulders. My butt, my elbows and knees stalked in and out like a frog's. I was almost free. At the final buoy, I turned and began a slow crawl back to the dock. It was either this or. What could I do? From then on, I swam in the evenings, repeating the triangle, crawl breaststroke roll, until my shoulders hardened into tight knots and my thighs braided themselves into ropes. With each inhale out of the water, I thought of the Dutchman, and with each turn back into the cold, I submerged my long-distance longing, the reality of the closed borders. He had been a client, an art dealer, who preferred to meet in museums rather than over lunch. A failed artist, he said, forced by necessity into commerce. First we took in the Van Gogh Museum, then the Stedelijk, then the Rijksmuseum, 3 times, where after the final trip, we rented a room by the hour. Brian worked late in The Hague at an ill-defined, low-paying job evaluating judicial systems in other countries against the American model. I knew he'd be unable to look at things directly, cleanly, and I'd exploited this. At the museum, the Dutchman led me to a traveling exhibit of Art Nouveau painters. Americans in Europe, he said. Like you. In front of a John White Alexander, he stopped me. Isabella and the pot of basil, he said. A woman in a long white dress exhaled against a ceramic pot rouged by the light. With her right hand, she caressed the belly of it. She was standing in a cold dusk. Her tunic was torn, exposing the flesh of her shoulder. Her eyes were closed. She has your mouth, the Dutchman said. He didn't touch me. He let the art do the work. It was this opening, this small aperture between the erotic and the sexual, this fractal evening light, this rough whirlpool of feeling, that I had found irresistible. He rented a small efficiency in the city center that overlooked a canal, not because he was married but because the distance to his house in Purmerend would shorten our meetings. As he touched me, he spoke in spooling, sorrowful sentences that held their own rhythm. Months passed. A year. Now I have forgotten how he takes his coffee. But before I left, he met me in a downtown park, one of the few spaces left where anyone could be outside their homes. The Dutchman walked in the shade of the magnolia trees, but when I'd approached him and squared my steps with his, a road of light stretched out in front of us. When he saw me, he didn't slow his gait, didn't remove his mask. Come on, I said. I can't take any risks, he said, and I found a tightness in his voice that had always been loose and tender. This whole thing was a risk, I said. And for what? He said. I leaned toward him so that my forehead touched his shoulder. There wasn't a need for a formal goodbye, an exchange of new numbers or addresses. I turned and walked off back across the park, back to my husband, in the direction that I had come. Just after we'd arrived back in the States, I asked the concierge at the hotel in the city to print the Boccaccio story that inspired the painting in the museum that had spurred our affair. I wanted to hold it in my hands, the story of the lovers, Isabella and Lorenzo. I wished the painting had shown Isabella on her knees in the grave of her murdered lover, dirt smeared across her forehead, her grip on the knife blanching her knuckles as she severs his head. The spray of blood as it bursts from the tendons and the muscles and the larynx that had once declared his love. I wished it had shown Isabella eating the basil that grew abundant in the pot nourished by the decomposing brains of her lover. All this time I thought the Dutchman was trying to capture his desire by showing me the painting, but really what he was trying to convey was devotion. He wasn't my puzzle piece, but he could have been. When summer finally arrived in full force, anyone who could make it to the lakeshore arrived with sullen children, duffel bags, boats stowed on trailers. Unlike other years when they might have all pooled out into the streets with cocktails or streamed down the lakeshore path in bikinis, the families quarantined themselves in their cottages. On the path into town, a family had set up a badminton net, but the two boys, elementary school aged, played only with each other. The birdie flew over the net but then floated lazily to the ground, a child's racket outstretched, flailing. I needed work, practically and existentially. We were running out of money. Not in an urgent sort of way, but certainly in a way that would limit our options upon our return to Amsterdam, if that were even still possible. I hadn't waitressed since college, but when I showed up to the brewpub looking for work, Carol was there. Oh sure, she said when I asked if she had any work. We will never close, she said, pouring me my usual. The governor can go fuck himself. Beer is an essential business. She gave me 4 evening shifts a week and 2 weekend lunches. I had to create the safety protocols myself. The pub played Cold War throwbacks from the 80s all day, Alphaville and the Enola Gay song, and that one by Billy Joel about the lights going out on Broadway. Initially, most of my shift involved pouring, passing, and sanitizing. Pour the beer from the tap. Pass the beer through the hole cut in the clear plastic tarp that covered the window. Sanitize the tap. Sanitize the credit card machine sitting outside. Sanitize hands. Repeat. I liked the evening shift. It was busier. More hands reaching toward mine for more beer. More lives to imagine myself slipping into, dashing off with into the pines. Carol knew everyone and introduced me with vigor, even though I was behind a wall, a screen, and a mask. What we had in common was a clawing sort of hunger for other people. I examined hands as they poked through the hole for their refreshments, imagined them stalking down my backside, creeping into the marshy mystery of myself, pulling my hair. I tried to differentiate the scent of my own animal breath clinging to the fabric of my mask from the individual musk or perfume of each customer. As they ordered, I closed my eyes to isolate the sensation of each voice, my body a boom and a mic, absorbing and recording the cadence of their tones. All the minor and major notes that could possibly fit into a beer order, repeating it to memory as I poured their drink and passed it through. Brian was often in bed by the time I returned home, having chased the witching sound of the bells as I walked along the lake shore, and that night was no different. I made myself a cup of hot cocoa and spiraled whipped cream on top, waiting until the cream melted to scoop the thin film off the top with my fingers. Brian snored through the wood paneling that separated the bedroom from the living room. I went into the bathroom and switched the head of my electric toothbrush to the spare I stored in my toiletry kit. I opened the blinds on the windows to let the night in. I lay down on the couch, facing the moon, and under the scratchy weight of the woolen blanket, I warmed up with a few light strokes of the bristles on my nipples, and then turning the brush to the smooth backside, to my clit. I thought of the Dutchman, and then Carol, the padding on her legs just above her knees, the constellation of freckles edging out of her scoop neck, the low growl of her voice. I thought of Michael Douglas and Demi Moore in Disclosure. The images I conjured were specific and meaningless. Outside, ribbons of green and purple rippled across the sky. The light reflected off the lake was orchestral. I controlled the transference of my own desire, its expansiveness, its limitlessness, how comforting it was to need in this way. I shifted my gaze and Brian stood in the doorway to the bedroom. Thinking of me, he said, I'm right here. Before I could click off the toothbrush, Brian moved to stand over me. He looked down at me. Slowly, he placed his hands with a gentle firmness around my throat so his palms touched in the middle and I felt his fingers fluttering closed against the back of my neck. He pressed down, looking into my eyes. I could still feel the smooth back of the toothbrush pulsing against me. Pleasure simultaneous with panic. Suddenly, he moved his hands away. He kissed my forehead, turned, and retreated back into the bedroom. His desire had always relied on a kind of benevolent dominance, but he had never put his hands to my throat or given up so easily. By the end of July, I could no longer tolerate the mystery of the ringing bells. I put on my running shoes and set off down the lake shore in search of the church. As the weather continued to warm, more signs of life broke the landscape. A red kayak tied loosely to a dock, a black labrador barking through the screens of a distant porch. After 2 or so miles, the cottages thinned out and disappeared entirely, as if suctioned back into the pines. Further on, I passed a small log hut and a sign that indicated I was entering a reserve. The path descended sharply and cut away from the trees until I rounded a bend and broke completely free of the forest. In front of me was a beach, long and wide with dunes that spilled into the water for as far as I could see. Black lines moved toward me through the gossamer of the sun, tiny, blinking apparitions against the bleached sand. People. 25, maybe 30 people moved toward me or away from me, like the gentle pull of a tide, spread out along the beach all the way to the horizon. As I grew closer, a few jogged past with a slow-motion stare. Some wore masks or bandanas around their mouths. No one spoke, no one waved. The only sound was the lick of the water on the shore and a very distant beating of drums. I took off my shoes, waded into the water up to my ankles, looked down at my reflection. Even the lake's gentle eddies couldn't soften the blackness pooling under my eyes. My cheeks looked spooned out. My hair, peppered with grey and grown lank past my breasts, alluded to a prehistoric abandon. I tightened the knot of the sweater around my waist and broke into a run. I ran and ran along the beach, past the people, the splash of the water like a cackle crashing through the silence. I mashed the sand with my toes. I pumped my arms and let myself be consumed by the violence of the memory of the world before. When I arrived home, Brian was asleep in the armchair, the news on mute, an adagio in G minor moaning through the cottage from a small portable speaker. "Is that what you do when I'm away? Our country is unraveling," he muttered. "Unraveling or just revealing itself? Have we been here long enough to really know?" I didn't care. My country neither interested me nor inspired any sense of fealty. I was beginning to see that what I had always been fleeing, Brian had been attempting to export. Once, our pursuit of the other, of the elsewhere, had disguised these differences in intent. "I found the beach and the dunes," I said. He looked startled. "On the way back, I took the forest path. Just where it started to climb higher into the hills, there was this patch of pink off to the side. A cluster of flowers. Bright, beautiful pink flowers." I looked up, high on the ridge line above. I saw the antlers first. Maybe the moose was eating, but when his head dipped it looked for a moment almost as if he were accepting a dance. The argument lifted off his brow. "The world isn't dying," I said. "Just we are." The next day at work I asked Carol about the bells. She was washing down the bar, wiping down the taps. She poured us both a harvest ale out of Grand Rapids. Her laugh came from deep within her abdomen. "The bells," she said, "are in the buoy." The ale had traces of anise, smoke. "There used to be a ferry to the Indian camp. Well, I don't know what they call them in Canada, but the ferry used to go back and forth and across the lake. The bells are in the buoys to warn it off the lake shore in a fog." "First Nation," I said. "The point is that we used to see them over here on our side. The camp down the road invited all their youngsters over for free. We sent doctors from town over to their clinic. The tourists took the ferry over. A great restaurant they had. Great drinks." She tipped her glass. Now we have no contact and new names. The border is closed. "As a woman I want no country," she said. "As a woman my country is the whole world." I raised my eyebrows. "Virginia Woolf," she said. "What, you think all people like me read is tabloids and Daniel Steele?" Toward the end of September, the weather dipped. I could feel the chill after I swam in the mornings, a reversal from the late spring when the air had been warm but the water frigid and bracing. One morning I came back from the lake and Brian was gone. He was home when I returned from my shift just after dinner, working on a new laptop, a series of history textbooks stacked on his desk. Good news, he said. I got a job. The high school had a last-minute opening for remote teaching. For the school year? You could be happy. We will have a steadier income. A reason to stay here. We agreed to leave in November. I thought about the apartment in Audi West, the rent we were still paying on it, only a tenuous promise of return. I thought about what I had left behind there. A woven blanket from Ecuador in bright colors, a set of Delft dinnerware, masks from a market outside Mombasa, two linen suits in the closet tailor-made in Hanoi, souvenirs not of cities but of happinesses, photo albums and diaries, marginalia of a life, our life, what we had shared, what I had thought we lived for. You never intended for us to go back, I said. We can stay here until next season. Save for a house. I walked to the window and looked out at the fog rolling in over the lake. I can really make a difference in this community with this job. You have zero teaching experience. How did you even get this job? So we will go back to Amsterdam and sit in that tiny apartment and watch the numbers climb even higher. You sit here all day and just read. As if reading is going to solve anything, as if any of this is any of our responsibility. Whose is it then? He said, but I had already walked out the door. At the pub, Carol was sitting outside, drawing a map of the lakeshore on a napkin. A Muslim family, the mother in a hijab, gathered around. Look up, she said. Sometimes on this trail you can see bald eagles. I sat down at the picnic table and studied Carol's map, crude but accurate. How far do you think it is across the lake? I said. As the crow flies, about 6 miles, she said. All through October I picked up more shifts at the pub. The days began to wilt and rot. Carol paid me in sweaty wads of cash and free 4-packs. I'd rarely stayed in a place long enough to witness the rituals of community, winning streaks of high school football teams, falling leaves. The summer residents were long gone, and a different sort of crowd filled the place. Day hikers, townies, drunks. Against regulations, Carol opened the doors and let everyone inside. By late in the month, even the news network that Carol mandated for the bar was covering a statewide surge of infections. It's all kicking off again, I said. Bottoms up, Carol said, her voice huskier than usual. We still have each other. I knew what she meant, but it wasn't true. On the way home from work, the clouds were muscular with moisture. When I arrived, Brian was sitting at his desk looking out at the lake, earphones in, a dozen or so teenage heads bobbing on his computer screen. I took a seat on the couch and watched him. He raised his voice slightly to ensure I heard him, adjusted his screen so I saw the series of slides he was sharing with the class. The lecture lasted nearly an hour, without interruption from the students. Ostensibly, the lesson was about the American colonies, which Brian had structured as point-counterpoint of the goals of the early colonists, city on a hill, and all that. With examples of atrocities committed against Native Americans and enslaved persons. The class was entirely white. The lecture was certainly persuasive, with plenty of visuals, but I saw the students' cameras flicker off one by one the longer the lesson went on. And as Brian's focus shifted from them to furtive glances over his shoulder where I sat on the couch. And that is why he said, nearing his conclusion, it's essential to protect our democracy, something we can only do by learning about it. He recounted his experiences in Khartoum, Nairobi, Aleppo, Doha. His cadence was almost liturgical, but the linkages to the lesson became harder to track. Surely he knew the pursuit of democracy had caused as many atrocities as it prevented. I didn't know if he viewed our country, now in a kind of existential crisis, as a cause du jour or if the good work he wanted to do here was meant to be a penance for a career looking outward. I remembered one winter in Aleppo. Brian had come home from an organizing meeting out in the provinces and was still wearing his flak jacket. We were running late to a dinner at the Baron Hotel hosted by the embassy. He spoke in urgent, staccato sentences about his day in our living room in front of where we had set up a small Christmas tree. Earlier that fall, we had celebrated Eid with a trip to the Wadi Rum. I had taken his photo next to an engraving of Lawrence of Arabia carved into the sandstone. Slipping out of his flak jacket and into his sport coat in the glow of the white lights from the tree, speaking with such a quick ease, floating words from Arabic into his dialogue, transitioning from the desert to a downtown hotel, moving fluently between constituent groups, I saw him as he saw himself. Under the tree was a present I would open later that week, a pendant of lapis lazuli engraved with our names, and Aleppo, 2010. The world was on the brink of exploding. As he aged, this coolness, this easy fluency had given way to a cloying desperation, perhaps for relevance, for his own legacy, that overwhelmed any sense of freedom that had made his early career so successful. His sentences had changed, lengthened. After class, he turned to me, triumphant. "What would you think?" he asked. "This is the hard work? Telling white kids about the black experience, or the Muslim experience, or the African experience? Because you have read a couple of books? Done a couple of stints with USAID? You work at a pub?" I rejected the snobbishness in what counted as community building work. I had sold culture and now I sold beer. Both were lubricants. He had sold regime change. The borders are open in the EU. I want to go home. Travel, Brian said, is a luxury for the rich at the expense of everyone else. It's escapism at its most grotesque. I looked at him sitting at that computer. I didn't recognize the rhythm of his sentences. He was a man who needed a reason to believe, who needed forward motion. I was tired, and progress was a false alarm, a meaningless term susceptible to a variety of agendas. I tallied an arsenal of losses, and then the things we had done and would continue to do for our self-edification. What we had stopped believing in. Travel has been the unifying force of this marriage. I had seen the capitals of the world. I could tell by the way he looked at me, an even, immovable stare, that he knew it. He alone would never be enough. Quietly, he said, "Then perhaps that too has meant nothing. What you're suggesting is that we stay here indefinitely." "You wanted to leave Kenya for Amsterdam," he said, "when we were so close to crossing the barricades." I was sick of Brian's posturing. It was nearly delusional to think we had any business meddling in Kenyan affairs. Marriage had whittled me down, smoothed out every edge with its sheer endurance. He had come here to see if what was broken could still be fixed, and perhaps I had known all along it could not, the affair notwithstanding. I missed my sharp edges, missed throwing an elbow to the jaw every once in a while. "You accomplished nothing in Kenya. Why would here be any different?" The wind banged the screen door shut, but he did not respond. That night the flag rattled in its bracket like a shackled ghost. Brian had not spoken since our argument earlier. I rolled over in bed and pretended I could translate his silence into feeling, as if it were like the dusting of snow accumulating outside. Something that I could firm up by gathering and pressing into a ball. Around midnight I uncovered my old rucksack from deep within the guest room closet. Outside, a branch cracked and collapsed into the shoreline. Packing quickly, silently, was something I knew how to do. I opened the front door in the morning. On the surface, everything looked smooth and clean. The great breast of dawn rose over the frozen lake, but there was sorrow in the sun. Not everything was as it had been. When the wind from the storm blew through, it took the color with it. As I set out over the ice, I thought of a line in a poem I'd read once, in college maybe, and even the thought of college distracted me, brought to mind faint traces of beer, leaves on a lawn, the plush of a hood pulled up over my ears, youth and a life full steam ahead, and all those sorts of feelings that had just been shaved and shaved away. Under the weight of my pack, I slipped on the ice. The blood surfaced to the skin of my knees. My shoes were inadequate. I struggled to regain my purchase. The words from the poem assembled themselves clearly from the jumble in my mind. Surely, it is a privilege to approach the end still believing in something. I thought of Virginia Woolf. I lunged forward, righting myself, and my gaze followed the line of my fingertips outstretched for balance, pointing northward to the narrowing frontier at the far shore of the lake. The church bells, they were just a buoy reeling a warning to a phantom ship, docked and dead on the pier in a still lake. How long had I been singing a hymn to a lie?